In January 1915, in the cruelest, most isolated place on Earth, Antarctica, 28 men began the worst nightmare of their lives. They were trapped in a frozen ocean for nearly 600 days, facing the grim reality of being buried forever in that white hell. What started as an ambitious expedition to cross the Antarctic continent quickly became a desperate fight for survival. Could all of them make it back alive? By the late 19th century, humanity had entered an unprecedented age of exploration, reaching the last unknown corners of the globe. Over 17 expeditions from 10 nations were sent to Antarctica. Their mission: to fill in the blank spots on the map, collect samples, study the climate, and unlock the secrets of this mysterious region. This was called the Heroic Age, not because of the triumphs, but because of the immense cost of discovery. There was no modern satellite navigation, no rescue team standing by, just blizzards, thick ice, and absolute isolation. That's why anyone brave enough to go was considered a hero. In 1901, a large-scale British expedition set off for the South Pole. A young officer on his first voyage was aboard: Ernest Shackleton. His small task was to manage the cargo transport with dog sledges. Even with a minor role, Shackleton pushed himself to the limit in this freezing land. Unfortunately, just over a year later, severe exhaustion forced him to leave. That failure was a critical moment, shaping him into the resilient leader he would become. By 1907, Shackleton decided to launch his own independent expedition. His single goal was to be the first to reach the South Pole. In early 1908, his ship landed at Cape Royds, a remote spot on the icy continent's northern edge. They set up camp and prepared to venture inland. They battled massive ice formations, relentless blizzards, and the seemingly endless polar night. On January 9, 1909, Shackleton was just 180 kilometers from his destination. But things suddenly spiraled out of control. Food supplies were running low, the weather worsened, and his men were dangerously exhausted. Facing the choice between personal glory and the lives of his crew, Shackleton made the decision to turn back. Though the expedition failed its main objective, he was hailed as a great leader who put the lives of his men before all else. 2 years later, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen carved his name into history as the first to reach the South Pole. The world celebrated. But for Shackleton, the journey to the icy continent was still unfinished. In December 1913, he announced an audacious plan: a land crossing of Antarctica. A truly wild but inspiring idea for the heroic age. To prepare, Shackleton sought companions who were up to the challenge. Legend has it, he posted an ad: "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." While no one has confirmed the ad's authenticity, it perfectly captures his spirit. He didn't care about their resume or education. His criteria were a strong mind, an optimistic attitude, and the ability to endure beyond normal limits. Over 5,000 applications poured in, but only 56 people from diverse backgrounds were chosen. The expedition split into 2 teams. One, led by Shackleton himself, would leave from the Weddell Sea. Their ship was the Endurance, a 3-masted vessel specially designed to withstand the harshest conditions imaginable. It was built by Norway's top shipwrights with an oak frame 76 cm thick and an outer hull covered in greenheart, one of the world's toughest woods. The bow was layered, and in places, the hull was over a meter thick. The Endurance also had a powerful steam engine and 3 lifeboats for the worst-case scenario. The second team would start from the Ross Sea near New Zealand. tasked with building a support station and burying supply depots along Shackleton's projected route. On August 8, 1914, after 4 years of meticulous planning, the expedition departed from Plymouth, England. World War I had just begun, but Shackleton still had the approval of the British government. For them, this was more than an exploration. It was a symbol of humanity's drive to overcome limits in the face of impossible conditions. So, Shackleton and 27 other men began their fateful journey across Antarctica, bringing with them 69 powerful sledge dogs and a cat companion. By January 18, 1915, the Endurance was only a day's travel from the Antarctic coast. Just like his previous attempt, the weather suddenly turned hostile. Giant ice floes driven by fierce winds converged from all directions, clamping the ship and trapping it solid in the middle of the ocean. At first, the crew believed the channel would open up in a few days, but that hope quickly vanished. The sea remained frozen, the Endurance wouldn't move an inch, and the distance to land was too great. The plan of 4 years was dissolving into thin air. They had no choice but to wait for spring, hoping warmer weather would melt the ice. But this was Antarctica. Winter was coming, and the sun would soon disappear. The men lived in total darkness for months. Time crawled by. After over a month of being stuck, Shackleton tried to free the Endurance by sheer manpower. The crew pushed, pulled, and used crowbars to chip the ice away from the hull. They worked for 2 exhausting days, but it didn't work. Shackleton changed his strategy. He started the engine, backed up a little, and then accelerated full throttle, hoping the Endurance could break free. It lunged forward, piercing through nearly 6 meters of ice, but only traveled about 400 meters before stopping completely. On February 24, 1915, Shackleton officially gave up trying to save the Endurance. The ship became an unplanned, drifting base, carried aimlessly by the cold currents. Most of the men took the situation calmly. They still believed that when the ice broke up, their journey would continue. To keep spirits up, they played soccer, told stories, and laughed in the sub-zero temperatures. Their living quarters were humorously called the Ritz, a sarcastic jab at their cold, cramped, and desolate room compared to a luxury London hotel. They even held a singing contest, with Shackleton winning the award for worst singer to the cheers of the crew. The atmosphere brightened even more with the birth of a litter of puppies, an invaluable gift that broke the monotony of months in a world of ice and snow. But that calm was just the quiet before the storm. A real nightmare was about to hit. The night of April 4, 1915, as the crew slept, massive ice blocks began to slowly press in. The Endurance was squeezed, and the sound of cracking wood echoed everywhere. The next morning, the ice around the ship had piled up in places, reaching 3 meters high. This was the first time the men truly felt the long-term threat. Shackleton immediately ordered the snow and ice around the hull cleared to reduce the pressure. But all efforts failed. Despite the meter-thick wood, the Endurance was helpless against the immense power of nature. The night of July 14th, they heard a series of strange sounds from the ship's bottom. One crew member suspected something inside the vessel had been destroyed. For the next few weeks, the Endurance took continuous, massive hits. The rudder was completely broken, and the ship was locked tight in the sea ice. For 7 months, they were stuck in a white world, nearly 2,000 kilometers from any civilization. No supplies, no rescue signals. They could only rely on their leader. In this terrifying situation, Shackleton maintained strict discipline, assigning daily tasks to every member. On October 18th, exactly 9 months after the Endurance was trapped, the end arrived. Winds and ocean currents shifted. causing enormous chunks of ice to compress the area where the ship was stuck. In seconds, the Endurance was pushed to a nearly 30-degree angle. The hull visibly twisted, then cracked open under the tremendous pressure of the ice. Waves of freezing seawater poured into the cabins. The men immediately rushed into a desperate, losing battle. They used every material they could find to plug the leaks. In the darkness, despair was etched in every heavy hammer swing, every trembling pull of the rope, and every piece of wood fixed by bloodied hands. At 5 p.m. on October 27th, Shackleton was forced to give the order to abandon ship. The men quickly regained their composure and gathered essentials: a few tents, some food, hand tools, weapons, and the 3 lifeboats. They loaded them onto the frozen surface. A new journey was about to begin, but this time they had no ship hull to protect them. Shackleton immediately announced the new plan. The crew would head for Paulet Island, where a supply depot had been buried years before. The destination was over 550 kilometers away. The next day, the journey began. They pulled the heavy boats forward, but every few meters, the crew struggled with ice ridges that stood like cliffs blocking their path. They used axes, picks, and bare hands to clear a way. In areas with fresh snow, the boats slid as if into a swamp, making them nearly impossible to steer. After an entire day of all-out effort, they had only moved a little over a kilometer. Shackleton decided to set up camp on a drifting ice floe and wait for the right opportunity, hoping the currents would carry them closer to land. He also sent men back to the wreck to salvage more food and the 3rd lifeboat. For the following days, the group slept in thin canvas tents. Though their bodies were exhausted, their spirits remained strong. Some even joked, "Now we can hunt seals right outside our tent." And that's exactly what they did. When ammunition ran out, the men used clubs and rocks to hunt. They would surprise a seal from behind, then kill it with a single brutal blow. In their free time, the group kept up old habits: reading, playing cards, or sharing jokes. By the end of November, the ice floe stopped moving. Hope for land grew fainter. After a long period of cold and monotony, optimism started to erode. The only daily comforts were the small food ration and a cup of hot powdered milk, which was also nearly gone. By February 1916, their diet was reduced to a little grilled seal meat and stewed penguin. Coffee had long since run out, and there was only enough tea for the final few cups. Even the most optimistic members began to despair. One even suggested the leader had been too careless, failing to gather all the food when he could. Time passed, and food grew increasingly scarce. On March 30th, Shackleton was forced to order the surviving dogs to be shot. This was not an easy decision. The men had raised them from pups, named them, and cared for them like family. Now, they had to pull the trigger to end those lives themselves. No one spoke. Only silence covered the ice like a bitter farewell. By April, the ice floe where they camped was less than 100 square meters wide. Large cracks started appearing more often. Shackleton quickly ordered everything packed up. The 3 lifeboats were launched. For the first time in months, they left the solid ice. They were now adrift in the Weddell Sea, one of the most dangerous waters in Antarctica. Around 11 p.m., they found an ice floe large enough for a temporary camp. Everyone was exhausted, but at least they could lie down for a few short hours. The next morning, the crew continued rowing, but they didn't know where they were going. For 2 days, there were only white-capped waves, whistling wind, and the endless ocean. Then, someone suddenly screamed as they saw land, but seconds later, strong winds blew the boats further away. The men were hit by waves. In the -40-degree cold, their clothes quickly froze, and their feet were numb with frostbite. They only slept once in 4 days. Some began to vomit. Others didn't have the strength to hold an oar. Hunger, cold, and uncertainty seemed to attack the men all at once. Shackleton still tried to maintain the team's routine. He guided each person, finding them a reason to live. After failing to reach Paulet Island, Shackleton decided to change direction. The new goal was Elephant Island, about 160 kilometers away. It was uninhabited, with no supplies, but if they could reach the shore, it would be the first time in over a year they had set foot on solid ground. Under Shackleton's command, they pressed forward. They lost an oar while trying to steer the boat, forcing them to use shovels and bare hands to break the ice gripping the sides. 3 days later, Elephant Island appeared right before their eyes. But violent currents scattered the group. One boat was swept away by a wave, carrying nearly a third of the men out of Shackleton's sight. He could only watch, powerless against nature. Another 5 days passed on the icy ocean, and Shackleton still hadn't sighted the missing boat. The crew was discouraged by the loss of their comrades. Their bodies were spent, and their feet were so blistered they couldn't feel anything. Just when hope was almost gone, a miracle happened. All 3 boats, somehow, met again at a narrow cliff on Elephant Island. After 497 days of isolation in the ice, they finally stepped onto land. But Elephant Island was a desolate wasteland. If they did nothing, they would die there. The only hope was the whaling station on South Georgia Island, about 300 kilometers away. Shackleton decided to risk everything. He chose the biggest lifeboat and, along with 5 other men, began the journey to find rescue. Shackleton knew this could be their last battle. Before leaving, he instructed every man to keep their spirits up, never give up, and that they would all survive. After saying goodbye to their leader, the remaining men began to build a shelter. They turned a boat on its side, used oars for support, and covered it with canvas to block the wind. Their daily routine was fixing the tent, melting snow for water, and cutting up seabirds to cook. Sometimes they tried to joke around to ward off despair. But the harsh reality quickly set in. The health of the men declined daily. Some couldn't feel their feet due to prolonged frostbite. Another was bedridden with abscesses spreading across his hip. One man had to pull his own teeth without anesthetic. By June, a crew member's gangrenous foot became critical. In the darkness of the shelter, the 2 doctors in the group had to perform surgery that lasted for hours. They had only an old knife, a bottle of chloroform for temporary anesthetic, and a thin thread of hope. Fortunately, the surgery was successful. Meanwhile, the situation for Shackleton and the 5 others was no better. On their 7-meter wooden boat, they faced waves as high as multi-story buildings. The sky was always gray. Strong winds battered the men's emaciated bodies. In the midst of that despair, all their faith rested in Worsley, the boat's navigator. He struggled to keep the compass steady to find their direction. But throughout the journey, Worsley saw the sun only once. The rest of the time, he had to rely entirely on instinct and experience. On May 6th, after 16 days adrift at sea, they finally sighted land. But reaching their destination was not easy. When they were just tens of meters from shore, high winds and waves blew their small boat away. After 2 weeks battling the ocean, the group finally landed on South Georgia Island. The problem was, they landed in the wrong place. The whaling station, the only sign of human life, was on the opposite coast. They decided to cross the mountain range on foot. Shackleton knew the lives of everyone depended on this decision. He took 2 men, Worsley and Crean. The 3 others stayed with the boat to wait for a signal. They took dry rations for 3 days, half a box of matches, 2 compasses, a small stove, 15 meters of rope, and an axe. Whether day or night, the three men walked without stopping. The difficult terrain forced them to constantly turn back, change direction, and start over. At night, they huddled together for warmth and shared the last of their food. Worsley and Crean often collapsed from exhaustion, but Shackleton wouldn't let anyone sleep. He knew that if they drifted off, they might never wake up. When they reached the top of the mountain, they found a sheer drop on the other side. Shackleton made a decision. He wrapped the rope around all three of them, linking them as one, and launched himself down the slope, leaving the rest to fate. They hit rocks, spun across the icy slope, and slid uncontrollably for hundreds of meters. When they finally stopped, all three were injured, but miraculously, they were alive. At 4 p.m. on May 20th, 1916, three emaciated men, their beards matted with cold, stumbled into the whaling station on South Georgia Island. Shackleton saw an old acquaintance. The man quickly recognized him and was utterly astonished. They couldn't believe that after nearly 2 years with no word, the expedition had survived. Rescue operations were immediately launched. For the next 4 months, Shackleton personally commanded the rescue vessel. However, all attempts failed due to thick ice and severe storms. It wasn't until the fourth attempt, on August 30th, 1916, that he finally reached Elephant Island. As the rescue boat approached the cold shore, Shackleton's breath caught in his throat. His eyes frantically scanned the beach. Finally, familiar faces began to appear one by one. All 22 remaining men had survived. The promise of their trustworthy leader, that no one would be left behind, had come true. Over a century later, in 2022, the Endurance was found on the seabed of the Weddell Sea. It lay hundreds of kilometers from where it was crushed, a silent witness to that incredible journey. In the 1950s, a professional survey team attempted to cross the mountains on South Georgia Island following Shackleton's exact route. They failed. To this day, no one can fully explain how Shackleton's men managed to achieve the impossible.